All right, so I'm going to talk today about like cryptoeconomics and Casper. Casper is like a proof-of-stake consensus protocol that I've been working on for a while, and a number of other people are working on, including very notably Vitalik, Carl, who you saw speak earlier, and a bunch of other people. So cryptoeconomics, this is my definition of cryptoeconomics, is the application of incentive mechanism design to cryptography and distributed systems problems. It's kind of an expanding of the cryptographer's toolkit to include incentives, as opposed to the expansion of like an economist or mechanism designer's toolkit to include cryptography and distributed systems. It's basically an application of incentives for information security goals. And Casper specifically is mechanism design applied to consensus. So a bunch of stuff that we're doing here is going to be about consensus specifically, and we're going to incentivize like a specific consensus protocol. But I'm not going to have time to present the consensus protocol in detail, but I'm going to talk about the things about the protocol which we need to talk about or need to know about in order to talk about what it takes to incentivize a consensus protocol, and like what that looks like, at least in Casper research. So we're going to spend our time really at this intersection of consensus and incentives, and we're going to see like this tight, like how you really need to know what you're incentivizing in order to incentivize it, and and there's like really end up being appropriate ways to parse out the incentives based on things that are kind of fundamental about the nature of consensus. So here's kind of our outline. We're going to have three parts. The first part is just about consensus, about what consensus protocols are, about a little bit about proof of work, a little bit about Casper, and I'm going to do a demo. If and hopefully it works. It's GIFs in the slides. And then part two, we're going to talk about incentivizing consensus. So specifically, like designing incentive systems for consensus protocols. Ensuring that incentives exist in proof of stake. Making following the protocol a dominant strategy for coalitional deviations. And maximizing the cost of an attack. And finally, I'm going to talk about a slightly more maybe esoteric topic of removing in protocol Byzantine fault tolerance thresholds from consensus protocols, which I think is important for economic purposes. There's more reasons than just the one covered there. It's going to be like a whole little section, but it is going to be the smallest one. So I'm going to cover consensus protocols, incentivizing consensus protocols, and then removing these fault tolerance thresholds from the protocols and why that helps with the economics. So the first part's going to be maybe the medium length, the middle part is going to be quite long, and then the last part's going to be quite short. So consensus protocols are really about nodes on the network who run the protocol making the same decision. And this is kind of what they were about when they were really first investigated in the 80s and 90s. And these decisions are final. They're kind of output values for the nodes that will never be reverted. There are three definitions that consensus protocols normally satisfy. Consensus safety means that nodes, when they decide on the same value. Liveness, which means they will eventually decide. And non-triviality, which means that there are protocol states which are kind of bivalent, meaning that they could decide either on like 1 or 0 or on one outcome or another. So that you can't just satisfy the first two definitions trivially. So basically, if we had a consensus protocol that always output the same value, you would have safety and liveness, but you wouldn't satisfy the non-triviality property, and therefore it's not really a consensus protocol. There are some things we know from consensus protocol research from like the 80s and 90s. Safety is possible in an asynchronous network, meaning that without any timing assumptions, it's possible to make consensus protocols where it's guaranteed that two nodes, if they decide on the same value, regardless of the timing assumptions of network propagations or times that it takes processes to finish, or synchronization of clocks. But it was also shown that liveness and safety together in an asynchronous network is impossible. It's kind of FLP impossibility. And this is like for deterministic protocols without any kind of cryptography or entropy, and also if they're in the context of some network fault. So if like any one message could fail, then you have this result for deterministic protocols. So Nakamoto consensus is a little bit weird in some way because it doesn't decide, right? It never actually makes these irreversible decisions. It just kind of chooses a fork, and hopefully after a while, you'll be assured that some block won't ever exit the fork choice. But it's actually not asynchronously safe. Even if we were to like say decide on blocks after like n confirmations, if you don't make any timing assumptions, then they're not really safe. You kind of see this intuitively just based on the fact that the security is based on hash rates, and rates are a kind of synchronous kind of thing. But Nakamoto consensus is safe and live in a partially synchronous network, at least for some unknown number of confirmations that you have to wait. So Casper, we're going to have like a blockchain that does fork, but also has decisions. Also has a point where blocks no longer can fork and nodes actually make irreversible decisions. And basically, I don't have a complete specification of the protocol about when nodes should make blocks. But I can show that we have a number of liveness strategies, a number of strategies that are live in a partially synchronous network. Okay, so now we're going to go do the demo. It's a little bit more exciting than the boring consensus definitions. So let me just explain out this drawing here. So we have these nodes are blocks. Yellow is like color code for tolerates one fault. The dark edges here, the solid gray lines are which are mostly covered up by other colors right now, pre-block pointers, like pointers to the previous block in that blockchain. The dotted lines are justifications. In this protocol, all the blocks are going to have pointers justifications, and the pre-block has to be the fork choice rule in the justification. So if you were to see the things in the justification and you were to conduct the fork choice rule, you have to end up with a blockchain that has this the head of the chain is the pre-block pointer. And then the blue lines correspond to the latest fork choice rules taken by the validators, and the red line corresponds to our fork choice rule looking at the protocol. So I said I'm not going to really be able to cover it in too much detail, but I figured I'd just tell you what the graphical representation kind of means. Great, here we go. So we have this blockchain kind of evolving. So we're going to watch it maybe a few times, but the blue lines kind of maybe are not all on top of each other up there, but towards the bottom they are. The fault tolerance, actually black means 4 faults, red is 3, yellow is 1. You'll see a large number of blocks sometimes being finalized at the same time after the addition of a certain message. The consensus protocol forks, but converges and eventually leads to actual consensus in the sense of asynchronously safe decisions. And if you were to decide at a third fault tolerance, then you would wait for them to turn red, say, or 50% fault tolerance, decide only on red blocks or black blocks. The cool thing about this is basically that it doesn't really use this kind of committee for producing 2/3 times the number of committee times 2 signatures to get a Byzantine quorum in every block. We're able to kind of redundantly use blocks to finalize multiple blocks at the same time. Can't cover this all right now, but we are going to talk about economic stuff in a moment. So here we have the same protocol, only now we're gonna orphan a block on every block. And the fork choice rule is this one in the middle. This validator in the middle has more weight than the other ones. 94, the other ones have lower weight. And this looks very much like a normal consensus protocol. You kind of get 2 rounds of messages before you get enough fault tolerance to make a decision. Here's kind of the more interesting one, the more exciting one. When we make messages in the blockchain, we eventually get to a point where every additional marginal block finalizes a previous block. This means that at the end of the day, we get to have a really low asymptotic cost of number of messages required for finalizing every given block. And if you look at, say, like the next block that's finalized, you notice that there's like the normal number of messages after it, namely like, 2 times the number of validators. Because every message is able to contribute to the finality of multiple blocks, we're able to reduce the network overhead required for consensus protocols that replicate virtual machines by quite a lot. And this would not be possible without forking. If you said like no forking, like this would not be possible because you need for every block to have a committee that breaches a Byzantine like quorum style signature before producing that block. So by accepting forking, we're actually able to achieve this really high level of efficiency of consensus. So while this talk really isn't about consensus, it's kind of it is actually notable that this is going to be an asynchronously safe protocol, and the fact that it has low overhead is kind of really cool. And talk to me about this after if you find this interesting. So great. So now we're at this like next section about incentivizing consensus, and we do really need to know about safety and liveness and asynchronous safety in order to understand kind of this problem. But first, we're going to talk about ensuring the existence of incentives in proof of stake, which has to do with the long-range attack and nothing at stake problems. Then we're going to talk about making correctness, as in following the protocol, coalitional dominance strategy, so that like for any coalition, it doesn't matter to them what anyone outside the coalition is doing. Their ideal strategy is to instruct all of their nodes to follow the protocol. It doesn't matter if you have more than half the weight, less than half the weight. It's always the rational thing for your coalition in terms of maximizing in-protocol payouts to follow the protocol. And finally, we're going to talk about maximizing the cost of attack. And we're going to see the relationship between the consensus stuff, especially in points 2 and 3. So ensuring the existence of incentives in proof of stake is kind of tricky because old coins may not be at their addresses anymore, and you can only really be incentivized by payouts that happen in the future. So there's this nothing at stake problem, which is the traditional problem with proof of stake protocols, where maybe you'll sign blocks on multiple forks, maybe you'll behave in a Byzantine manner because there's no disincentive for you to do that. And there's kind of this was kind of solved in like 2 kind of stages. One of them Vitalik proposed back in, I think, January of 2014, this protocol called Slasher, which basically will remove the block reward from any validator who's caught being Byzantine, or specifically by voting on or mining on competing forks. And then we kind of improved this significantly some months later by using security deposits, where basically to participate you have to place a security deposit, which you place an expectation of being rewarded for it. But if you are Byzantine and the protocol finds out about it, then you lose your deposit. And this kind of addresses the nothing at stake problem. And the idea there is there's something at stake, it's the security deposit, and there are conditions under which you lose it. And those conditions are the conditions that kind of enforce the economics of the protocol, right? The conditions under which you lose money are, the outcomes in which you have negative payouts, and that you're disincentivized from falling into by, and therefore incentivized to avoid by whatever means necessary. And then there's this kind of long-range attack problem, which I alluded to a little earlier, about old keys no longer being meaningful because they're no longer associated with deposits. Well, basically, we need to kind of change the authentication model of a blockchain from to move into this world where we're using proof of stake. Instead of starting from the genesis block, you really need to have a list of people who currently have deposits. If they don't currently have deposits, you can't currently trust their signatures because they're not being incentivized by these slashing conditions. So instead of starting from the genesis block, you start from this list of people who currently have deposits. You use their signatures to authenticate the consensus and to update that list. So for the first time you authenticate the consensus, you need an out-of-band source of this information. Maybe you need a hash out-of-band in order that you can use to authenticate the list of people with deposits, which you then use to maintain that list updated over time. Maybe you come online once every X months, 4 months, in order to update your list so that next time you come online, you'll know who has deposits, and you'll be relying on signatures from people with deposits. And so basically with security deposits, and by having authentication end in a list of security deposits rather than in the genesis block, we can kind of guarantee that incentives exist in proof of stake and kind of get around this whole long-range attack and nothing at stake problems. And this is kind of really fundamental to making proof of stake make sense from under like a kind of pure economic analysis where you assume that all the players are rational, right? Because if you don't authenticate from something recent where they like have deposits, then well, they're not going to have any disincentive from being Byzantine, right? You sell your keys for free to some actor, or maybe for like a small amount of money. You enjoy the money, and they enjoy your keys to behave in a Byzantine way with more than half the stake. Or if if the validators have nothing at stake, then you could just bribe them all to behave in a Byzantine way, and you shouldn't be surprised when more than your fault tolerance threshold of them are Byzantine, because they didn't have any disincentive to. So really, like I think security deposits, slashing conditions, and this authentication model that starts with deposits rather than the Genesis block are really the only way to guarantee the existence of incentives to proof of stake. We're talking about like kind of the biggest possible incentives. So we're going to try to make following the protocol a dominant strategy. And the way we're going to do this is with this concept called fault attribution. Fault attribution is basically about determining which nodes, who done it, right? Like which nodes caused the faults, right? If there's some kind of issue, who's at fault, right? And if you can detect deviations from the protocol, you can detect, who failed to send messages, who created messages in a Byzantine manner, and then you can penalize that behavior. And if you can do fault attribution, then you can penalize it. It's like kind of really like that simple. If you can detect faults, you can penalize them. So our ability to infer faulty behavior, infer exactly who did it, is going to really be a fundamental limit on our ability to incentivize these protocols. And if we can penalize all observable faults, then not producing observable faults will be a dominant strategy, because you will kind of lose money for doing it and not lose money otherwise, regardless of what other players are doing. Of course, like at the end of the day, the incentive mechanism exists in the consensus protocol for these blockchains, and so all of the messages which are going to affect the payouts have to be in blocks, have to be included in blocks. And so from a view from inside the consensus, the incentive mechanism infers who committed which faults, who deviated from the protocols in which way, and will penalize them. And if it can do that enough, then we can make it a coalitional dominant strategy to follow the protocol, which I think is like really great, because we want it to be in equilibrium to follow the protocol at very least. We thankfully, knowing stuff about consensus can actually make it a really long way there. Safety faults are perfectly attributable, and liveness faults are imperfectly attributable. We kind of have this as a result for our protocol, and I think for a general class of protocols, at least if we were allow to append some things to their messages. So safety faults are kind of two types: invalid messages and equivocation. Invalid messages basically sounds like what it is, like you make an invalid block. You send a message that never could have possibly been produced by someone who's following the protocol. Equivocation, on the other hand, is kind of like you make two versions of your protocol process and you feed it different inputs so that they produce different outputs, and you selectively show them from different versions of the protocol process. And this is kind of this is the attack that's like the classic attack on consensus, where like the messages from the intersection of the nodes, that two nodes C, could be running two versions of the code, one for one and one for the other, in order to like lead to like a lack of consensus. And then there's liveness failures. Liveness faults are, omitting messages, failing to send messages, reordering messages. Liveness faults are indistinguishable from network latency. And that's kind of why they're called liveness faults in some way, but also because, and here, this is really actually, this is the real link here. Liveness faults don't cause safety failures. Liveness faults in an asynchronously safe consensus protocol cannot cause safety failure, right? If you are faulty in a way that's indistinguishable from network latency, and the protocol is safe to arbitrary network latency stuff, then if there's a safety failure, it wasn't caused by a liveness fault. It was caused instead by a safety fault, and safety faults fall into these two classes. For certain protocols. And namely, the thing that I need for these protocols is that I can detect invalid messages, And or to do the attribution, we need to detect invalid messages by looking at them on the wire, and we need to be able to detect equivocation by either having sequence numbers or pointers to previous messages sent by a node, so that you can see if there's more than one of them running in parallel. Basically, yeah. So we can tell exactly who produced a safety fault if messages are all signed, if you can tell from looking at a message whether it's invalid, and whether if we have sequence numbers or pointers to the previous message. Because if we have sequence numbers or pointers to the previous message, we can kind of check whether we have a single thread of messages from this validator, and if that thread ever breaks off into two, then that represents an equivocation and is a Byzantine fault, even though it's only producing valid messages. And safety faults are uniquely attributable because they're source authenticated, and these things are kind of objectively verifiable. Or you can objectively check for equivocation using this property here. Liveness faults can be attributed also, but kind of imperfectly, right? If we expect Alice to send a message to Bob, and do we expect this to be evidenced by a message from Bob, which is contains which is a signed message from Alice, and this message never appears, then there's kind of a bunch of things that could have happened, right? Alice could have failed to send the message. Bob could have received it and failed to include it. Bob could have failed to send the message, like the signed one. But one of Bob or Alice was faulty, or the message is still on the network. So even though we don't know who's done it, we know it was either Bob or Alice. And so we have imperfect fault attribution. So it wasn't successful, and it may be that neither of them are faulty, but it could be that they are faulty. And so we have this imperfect fault attribution for liveness faults. So in the consensus protocol, rather than thinking about just like Alice being incentivized to send a message to Bob, we have, they're incentivized to build a blockchain, and this represents really them being, being incentivized to send blocks to each other, and you have a similar kind of pattern where if someone's missing when they're meant to be there, they may have been faulty. But it may be that everyone else is faulty and ignored their message. And we can't really tell who has done it because liveness faults are not attributable. They're not perfectly attributable. But still, we know that it was either the guy who went offline or the people whose blocks got in the chain, censoring them. And so basically, with fault attribution, we can penalize deviations from the protocol, right? If you commit a safety fault or a liveness fault in a way that causes the protocol evolution to deviate in any way from the way the protocol expected, someone can be identified who may have been faulty or definitely was faulty, and they can be penalized. And that means that even if they weren't faulty, they might be penalized. But we do have this property that if you are faulty, then you will be penalized. Therefore, being faulty is disincentivized, and therefore following the protocol is an equilibrium, dominant strategy equilibrium, because you don't care what everyone else does. You're still penalized more if you exhibit faults than if you don't. So that's pretty cool. So we have protocol incentives existing in proof of stake, and we have it being a dominant strategy for coalitions to follow the protocol, no matter what the size of the coalition. Now we're going to try to maximize the cost of attack. Maximizing the cost of attack basically requires coming up with an adversary and like an ideal adversary, which attacks at minimum cost, and then tweaking the parameters of the protocol, which are going to be the penalties and rewards, in order to maximize the cost of attack, meaning to maximize the budget that the adversary needs to spend in order to commit a certain amount of faults that achieves a certain end, maybe violating a safety or liveness property of the blockchain. So we're going to need a few things to maximize the cost of an attack. We're going to need a model of participation, right? If there's more security deposits bonded, it's more expensive to attack because it takes more deposits to make up the fault count that you need of validators that you need in order to conduct your attack, right? If you need half of the validators and there's twice as much bonded, you're going to need twice as much money. And if those faults that you're intending to commit are perfectly attributable, then you're going to actually maybe lose all of that money. If there's less money participating, then it's cheaper to attack. And we need to kind of know, what the attacker's doing, right? We need to like choose an attack and maximize the cost of like that attack. And normally we pick censorship because censorship is kind of like the most like fundamental, one of the the most fundamental attacks against the blockchain. And by that I mean like if you can censor it, you really kind of like have control of it in a way where you get to determine the future validators, and really get to determine what transactions get in the blockchain, and is in some way the result of imperfectly attributable faults, and therefore is like an easier attack to do than attack that attacks safety, which creates these perfectly attributable faults, where you can be penalized much more. Let's do a little experiment and assume that all faults are perfectly attributable. In this case, it's going to be actually much easier to maximize the cost of an attack. If faults are perfectly attributable, then we basically maximize the cost of an attack by removing all of your deposit whenever you commit any fault, right? Because if you commit a fault, we know it was you. No one else could have done it, and so if we take away all your money, like the claim is that this maximizes the cost of an attack. And basically, here's kind of the argument. If we have some amount of revenue for the monitors, if you participate honestly, you're not going to exhibit that fault. You will have your deposit at the end of the period, and you'll earn interest upon it. If there's the cost of capital of some cost of capital, then you can imagine that the revenue divided by the cost of capital will be the amount bonded, or the amount that honest nodes will guarantee will be bonded. So at equilibrium, even if there's some dishonest nodes, honest nodes will come up and top it up until the return for being honest, is in the protocol is the market equilibrium, rate of profit. In this case, for any amount of revenue, we get the same amount bonded, and the attacker, if they need P% of the stake, can lose up to X times P, and they will lose X times P because they're going to commit perfectly attributable faults. And so if we just take away all their money, is really the most we can do to penalize attackers. So if we have perfectly attributable faults, this problem is quite easy. However, we kind of know that liveness faults are not perfectly attributable due to the nature of distributed systems and kind of the problems of distributed systems. But we need to penalize liveness faults because otherwise we don't have a dominant strategy following the protocol. And especially if we need to penalize them if we want to maximize the cost of committing some of these liveness faults, like say censorship. However, when you penalize someone for a liveness fault, they may not actually be faulty, right? Because liveness faults are not perfectly attributable. And that makes it kind of unfair. It means that an adversary can reduce your profitability even though you're honest, which means that an adversary can discourage participation in the protocol. And this is kind of really why we need a model for participation in order to maximize the cost of attacking the protocol. Because with a model of participation, we can think about an attacker that first discourages participation and then bonds enough in order to conduct their attack and undermine protocol guarantees. And that's really what the ideal attack on these protocols is going to look like. Phase one, we're going to discourage participation. We're going to participate in a way that causes other miners to drop out, other validators to leave because they're operating at a loss. And then after doing that for some time, then we bond and commit the intended faults. And this is kind of like the ideal attack. And then depending on the model for participation, the optimal attack will have different costs in the end, right? Because the attacker loses money to discourage people, right? They lose money to cause other people to lose money, and then they lose money committing the liveness faults or whatever faults after they're bonded. Sometimes in theory and with numerical methods, it's possible sometimes to calculate the cost of an attack and then to choose a parameterization which maximizes the cost of the attack. But it's still challenging, and it's something where the model for participation is unlikely to be very accurate because in real life, at least in the short term, there's going to be all sorts of weird behavioral effects around deciding to participate, right? People are going to want to bond just because they are excited to be a validator. They're going to there are behavioral effects that make people maybe discouraged when things are unfair more than an economically rational agent might be. And depending on what kind of behavioral effects are dominating at the moment, it may be that a certain parameterization or another would maximize security. And so having a model for participation is required really to parameterize these things to maximize the cost of an attack. But making a reasonable model for participation might involve weird behavioral effects that are kind of like that change randomly over time sometimes. And so thinking of a reasonable or defensible model for participation for doing this parameterization is kind of an interesting and open problem in this kind of cryptocurrency design. Something I should also mention is that actually, like, like these types of attacks are actually not even necessary in protocols when you don't have penalties for liveness faults or where you don't have penalties for safety faults, because it's profitable for the coalitions to seek to just undermine the protocol guarantee anyways. And so the attacker ends up not having to pay anything in these kind of behavioral models, where the coalitions will just do the profitable thing and undermine the protocol of their own accord, really, or maybe for like an epsilon, a little nudge from the attacker. So basically, people are going to have different behavioral effects. I talked about bonding just to try it, unfairness, and also people might bond to kind of defend the protocol, or because they support the protocol, or they have some attachment to it for other means, right? And so we definitely need help studying this to maximize the cost of an attack by doing this parameterization. And I think that's pretty cool. So now we're going to move to like this last section of the talk about like removing in protocol fault tolerance thresholds. Normally we have in protocol fault tolerance thresholds for consensus protocols because they're derived to have safety and liveness in the context of a certain number of faults. And nodes make decisions after receiving messages from a certain amount of nodes, like enough of them to give them that level of fault tolerance, and then they just like decide, right? Basically, everyone has the same fault tolerance threshold, and everyone makes decisions only when they're safe up to that fault tolerance threshold. But we were able to, in like Casper the Friendly Ghost, move fault tolerance thresholds entirely out of the protocol, where different nodes could have different fault tolerance thresholds, and they'll decide when things are safe for their particular fault tolerance threshold. And we also managed to rotate validators to change which nodes are coming to consensus without having an in-protocol fault tolerance threshold. And this actually has like a lot of important kind of economic properties, right? When an attacker is attacking your protocol, if they know the fault tolerance threshold that a node makes their decisions at, it's easier for them to attack. There is also a really strong cartelization effects around these fault tolerance thresholds, because a cartel has way more powerful once they've reached a fault tolerance threshold, or once they are so big that they know that an adversary can't reach the fault tolerance threshold. Another thing that's kind of important, and was actually mentioned in a talk yesterday, is that nodes after after Byzantine quorum forms marginally contribute nothing to safety of these protocols with an in-protocol fault tolerance threshold, right? Like the 68th percentile or like 69th or 70th node into the Byzantine quorum that's producing this consensus signature contributes nothing to the safety of these nodes, because there's an in-protocol fault tolerance threshold, and it's just like, you've either made a decision or not, you always have a third fault tolerance, and so anyone who isn't in that cartel provides no value. And I think that is quite bad, both because if you're participating in the system, you want to know that you're providing value, and because if you do have this coalition that has maximum value, they can deny you payment or censor you only if you give them back payment. There's game theory problems that arise around these fault tolerance numbers. And so I think removing them from our protocols is really helpful if we can do it. And I think that we can. So let's wrap up. So we basically designed this protocol from the start to be incentivized, and from using economic thinking from the start, and trying to get all of our guarantees from our slashing conditions, from the fact that nodes will avoid trying to trigger the protocol from costing them money. We've managed to make following the protocol a coalitional dominant strategy equilibrium, which isn't possible in proof of work consensus. And I haven't seen in any other kind of non-Casper consensus protocol, because it doesn't seem like anyone really is comfortable punishing liveness faults except for us. But you'll come around. And it's impossible to have a dominant strategy, coalitional dominant strategy in proof of work, because the proof of work consensus protocol does not know where the miners are. And so if a majority of the hash power ignores blocks from other miners, the protocol has no idea that they're missing, right? It's not aware of these liveness faults. Therefore, it can't do even imperfect attribution, and it can't penalize them, which means that it can't be a dominant strategy to follow the protocol. We kind of know how to maximize cost of an attacker, given a model of participation under this kind of coordinated choice game theory, where basically we assume that like cartels have no cost of enforcing their cartel strategy. I think we're still working on this. We still need to like come up with models of participation that everyone agrees with, and that which are kind of defensible for protocol design. But most protocols, every non-Casper protocol that I know has a negative cost of attack, meaning that like you can attack it profitably, and therefore the attacker doesn't need to actually spend anything. And so I think this type of work, where basically we're thinking about incentives on top of fault tolerance, rather than only thinking about fault tolerance, or we think about why faults are disincentivized rather than only just assuming that people won't be faulty, I think is really valuable. And I think that if you look at the world in this way, you'll find a lot of suboptimality in terms of the economics of consensus protocols. A lot of them you can only really show that it's rational to mine on the longest chain if enough of the other miners are honest. There's definitely no sense that there's like a unique dominant equilibrium to follow the protocol. Because like if the other players are not following the honest strategy, then all of a sudden, all bets are off. We know how to remove fault tolerance thresholds from these consensus protocols. Actually, this is something that we kind of got inspiration from the Nakamoto consensus, where you kind of locally count confirmations rather than having in protocol thing that says, okay, this is the number of confirmations, and then you make a decision and you're done. However, like Nakamoto consensus, unfortunately, is not really optimal because of the lack of asynchronous safety. Not to mention the lack of Nash equilibrium. Also, just got to mention again our like really great low overhead per block of consensus for asynchronously safe decisions. So we've come quite a long way. We have a lot of clear definitions, problem statements, even some solutions. I hope you find it interesting. At least maybe I hope to see some of you contribute, and at very least learn more about our work. Thanks a lot for listening. Really appreciate it.
You have the box? Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Vlad. Could you go back a few slides? I'm curious if you could go into more detail about what does Nakamoto consensus not do? Yeah.
You can't detect censored miners.
Censored miners.
You can't detect censored miners.
And Casper will be able to detect censored miners. So this is where they're cut off from the network and no messages are being transmitted?
Yeah, imagine that like you're a miner and your blocks are being orphaned. The proof of work protocol can't detect that.
Right.
If you have a security deposit, the protocol can tell that, look, this dude has a security deposit. There's no blocks from that validator in actually getting in the longest chain.
Wow. Yeah, that's an impressive example. Thank you.
Cheers.
Anybody else?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Vlad. That was a great flow. It helped clarify quite a few things. So my question is, there's a internal incentive model where you balance the attacker potential gains and the loss of the stake. But obviously, there's an external attacker model where I just want to destroy the network because all my money is in Zcash. Now, from this perspective, what I feel, and maybe you can answer this as a kind of as your opinion on this. What I feel like the proof of stake is doing is basically dialing in a number, which can be 1 million ethers or 10 million ethers, for an attacker to be able to actually invest into destroying the network. Is this?
Yeah, I think there's definitely there's a cost to destroying a network. There's a cost to destroying any cryptocurrency network, and our goal here is to maximize that cost, right? And the kind of belief is that the higher the cost, the more extra protocol incentive you need to actually justify incurring that cost. And so, just because you can look at the number doesn't mean that you want to spend that money, right? And I think actually, like, there's a lot of security that comes from just knowing how hard and expensive it will be to attack a protocol.
But is there anything in the research or in your plan that says, at least I want to make that number kind of unknown high, such that you can't quite tell, okay, all I need to do is invest this money?
Well, I mean, you
That's part of
can't
this.
quite tell anyways, because you don't. I mean, it depends with the attack, right? You can tell if you say you're trying to do censorship, but if you're trying to attack the safety of the blockchain, then you can't quite tell because you don't really know the fault tolerance thresholds that people are using. But having the number be unknown because it's hard to measure, versus having the number be unknown because or I guess like it's not that actually that it doesn't actually provide that much assurance, right? Just because it's not that easy to tell the cost of attacking proof of work doesn't mean that like there isn't a cost and it's not way lower.
Very interesting work, then. Thank you.
Sure.
There's another one over there.
Thank you. So just want to preface by saying Tendermint is working on similar questions as well. But my question is more about, so in non-attributable faults, do you have a way of determining some sort of ratio on how to punish people? So for example, if let's say there was 5 validators, one of them's down, I mean, the easy way to go is punish him X and punish the other 4 1/4 X, but that assumes that there's a 50-50 chance of someone being down versus being censored. How do you determine this ratio to make it fair and whatnot?
Well, actually, we do it there's a couple ways to do it. One of them, but the thing that I advocate is the maximizing the cost of the attack thing. And basically the way that works is there's 2 phases of the attack. One where the attacker makes you lose money. And so if they can lose a little bit of money to make you lose a lot of money, they discourage faster, right? So if you were to make so there's this type of analysis called griefing factor analysis, which looks at how much money you can lose to make someone else lose $1, right? Or if I lose $1 and make you lose $1, versus I use one to make you lose 2. There's 2 different griefing factors. So there's the first stage of attack. The attacker discourages, and in the next stage of attack, the attacker bears penalties, right? And so if you want to increase the penalties that the attacker pays when they're, say, censoring, that means that you have to make it easier for them to discourage. And so there's a trade-off that really needs to be prioritized to make this optimization, to make the optimal attack more expensive. So basically, I mean, that is really the process. Somewhat more abstractly, we need to decide the structure of the penalties before you parameterize them. And there's a bunch of structures that we're kind of looking at. The simplest one is you have a DAG of messages which you expect, and a DAG of messages you've seen. If there's an edge missing in that DAG, you penalize the nodes on either side, and then you treat basically the problem as a whole bunch of instances of incentivizing Alice to send a message to Bob. And you can parameterize them in order to maximize the cost of causing Alice not to send a message to Bob, or causing these messages not to end up being propagated. So I hope that helps.
Anybody else?
Okay, one more question. So when you're adding in penalties for network latency, for instance, that are indistinguishable from network latency. The biggest example that I've seen in network latency is actually systematic latency with the Great Firewall of China, which we did a big study on with Bitcoin. And that results in some adversarial conditions where maybe China wants to keep all of their blocks inside China before they give them outside or something. So I'm wondering if this just seems like a big salient example. And do you have something to say on that with respect to Casper penalties for latency?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so imagine if the expectation is for us to make this great round-robin blockchain that gets finalized with a minimum number of blocks per block. Then imagine the 4th node there is in China. Then what should happen is the 5th node should wait as long as the fourth node needs to get there, and as long as the fourth node only takes like a relatively predictable amount of time, it's possible for them to do that, and they'll get higher payouts for doing that, right? So it's more the unpredictable delays that really cause the issue. Predictable delays are something you can work around with timeouts, right? So to some extent, we provide the incentive for them to fill the shape. And it's up to the miners to figure out, or up to their like software to figure out what the appropriate delays are to make that happen. And if they're consistent, then that'll be possible. And so this is flexible enough to deal with that. When you're talking about like more like other events, yeah, of course. I mean, people could be penalized due to third parties that are not even in the network DOSing them, and screwing up this blockchain. But I mean, it's their incentive to stay well connected.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Vlad.